Sometimes the loudest warnings come in silence. Sometimes what we bury deepest refuses to stay hidden. And sometimes the animals know before we do that the past is clawing its way back to the surface. 58-year-old Margaret Chen lived alone at 7,400 feet in the Bitterroot Range of Montana, where the lodgepole pines grew so thick that sunlight only reached the forest floor in scattered coins of gold. Her cabin sat in a clearing she'd carved herself, logs chinked with mortar she'd mixed by hand, a metal roof that shed snow without complaint, and a stone foundation that had been there long before she arrived. She'd been here for 6 years. 6 years since the divorce. 6 years since she'd walked away from a life in Seattle that had felt like drowning in slow motion. 6 years since she'd decided that if she was going to be alone, she might as well be alone on her own terms, in a place where silence was honest instead of accusatory. The cabin was small, one main room with a wood stove, a kitchen area that was really just a counter and a basin, a bedroom barely large enough for a bed, and a loft she used for storage. Everything was within arm's reach. Everything had a purpose. No clutter, no excess, no reminders of the woman she used to be, the woman who'd taught environmental science at the University of Washington, who'd had colleagues and dinner parties, and a husband who'd slowly, methodically convinced her she was too intense, too difficult, too much. Margaret preferred the mountains. They didn't require explanation or apology. She woke most mornings at first light, earlier in summer, later in winter. The rhythm matched the sun, not a clock. She'd build up the fire if the night had been cold, make coffee in an enamel pot that had belonged to her grandmother, and stand on her porch watching the mist rise from the valley below. Her daily routine was simple. Check the solar panels, haul water from the spring 200 yards downhill, tend a small garden she'd terrace into the southern slope, split wood, repair whatever needed repairing. In the afternoons, she'd hike, sometimes for hours, relearning the landscape she'd studied in books, but never truly understood until she lived inside it. She still worked, technically. She wrote field guides for wilderness publishers, identified plant species for botanical surveys, consulted remotely on environmental impact studies. The satellite internet was spotty, but it was enough. She made maybe $30,000 a year. It was plenty when you didn't spend money on anything but supplies. Her only companion was Shadow. The wolf had appeared 3 winters ago, limping through deep snow, his right rear leg caught in a trap some idiot had set illegally on Forest Service land. She found him at dawn half frozen, eyes wild with pain and fury, teeth bared even as he was dying. Any reasonable person would have called fish and wildlife, would have kept their distance. Wolves are protected, but they were also dangerous, unpredictable. You didn't approach a wounded predator unless you had a death wish. But Margaret had looked into those amber eyes and seen herself. Trapped, furious, refusing to die quietly. She'd tranquilize him with medication she kept for emergencies. She'd learned to handle wildlife injuries during her years studying wolf populations in graduate school. She'd removed the trap, cleaned the wound, splintered what she could. She'd built a cage in her shed and kept him there through that first brutal winter, feeding him elk meat from her freezer, changing his bandages, talking to him in the low, steady voice her grandmother had used with injured animals on their farm in Oregon. By spring, the leg had healed crooked but functional. She'd opened the cage door, expecting him to run. He'd walked out, circled the cabin twice, and settled on the porch. He'd been with her ever since. Shadow was huge, nearly 150 pounds, gray and black with those amber eyes that missed nothing. He hunted his own food most of the time, disappearing for days into the high country, returning to sleep on the porch or, in deep winter, inside by the stove. He never howled, never made a sound beyond the occasional huff or whine. Margaret had read that wolves howled to communicate with their pack, to claim territory, to call each other home. Shadow had no pack. Maybe he'd decided howling alone was pointless. She'd named him Shadow because he moved like one, silent, present, always at the edge of her vision. He was the only living thing she trusted completely, the only relationship she had that didn't require her to be smaller or quieter or different than she was. People in the nearest town, Millbrook, 40 minutes down a forest road that required 4-wheel drive and nerves of steel, knew about her. The Wolf Woman, they called her, with a mixture of respect and wariness. She went to town once a month for supplies: flour, coffee, ammunition, propane, seeds. She'd exchange brief pleasantries with Tom Grady, who ran the general store, and leave. She didn't mind the nickname. Didn't mind being strange. Strange was safer than known. Her ex-husband, David, had told her during the divorce that she was incapable of connection, that she'd push people away the moment they got close, that she'd rather be right than happy. He'd meant it as an insult. She'd taken it as instruction. The cabin sat on 20 acres she'd bought outright with money from her grandmother's estate. The deed was in her name alone. The property had come with a foundation, old, weathered stone that looked like it had been there for a century, but no structure. She'd built everything else herself, with help from a contractor for the things she couldn't manage alone. Before she'd left, Tom at the general store had mentioned something about the property's history. Old homestead, he'd said. Family lived there back in the 20s or 30s, I think. Place burned down. They never rebuilt. Land's been empty since. She'd nodded, not particularly interested. She wasn't looking for history. She was looking for escape. But sometimes, late at night when fire burned low and the wind moved to the pines like whispered conversation, she'd think about those people. Who had they been? Why had they left? What had burned? The foundation was all that remained, a rectangle of stacked stone, partially buried, visible only if you knew where to look. She'd built her cabin on top of it, using the existing structure as support. It seemed practical. Waste not. She'd never thought to ask what the stone foundation had been supporting before her cabin. Never thought to wonder if there was more below ground than above. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. That change in night shadow started howling. Section 2, the catalyst, inciting incident. Margaret woke to a sound she'd never heard before. It started low, almost inaudible, a vibration more than a noise. Then it grew, a long, mournful cry that raised every hair on her arms and sent ice down her spine. Shadow was howling. She sat up in bed, heart hammering, reaching for the flashlight on her nightstand. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to coals. Through the window, she could see moonlight silvering the clearing. Stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The howl came again, longer this time, full of urgency and something that sounded almost like grief. She pulled on her boots and jacket, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. The October night was cold, temperature already dropping into the 30s. Her breath plumed white in the moonlight. Shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, not on the porch where he usually slept, but about 30 feet from the cabin, near the old root cellar door. The cellar had been there when she'd arrived, a wooden door set horizontally into the ground, weathered gray and partially buried under years of fallen pine needles and debris. She'd tried to open it once in her first year, curious about storage space, but the door had been swollen shut, the wood warped and the hinges rusted. She'd given up, deciding she didn't need it anyway. The loft provided plenty of storage. She'd forgotten about it until now. Shadow stood over the cellar door, rigid, head thrown back, howling at something she couldn't see. "Shadow," she called, her voice sounding small against the vastness of the mountain night. "What is it, boy?" He looked at her, amber eyes catching the flashlight beam, then back at the door. He pawed at it, whined, and howled again. The sound was primal, desperate. It was the sound of an animal trying to communicate something urgent, something that mattered. She approached slowly, boots crunching on frost-crisp needles. Shadow didn't move, just watched her with an intensity that made her uneasy. She directed her flashlight at the cellar door. It looked exactly as it always had. Weatherwood, old iron hinges, no visible reason for alarm. "There's nothing there," she said, as much to herself as to Shadow. "It's just an old cellar, probably full of spiders and rot." But Shadow wasn't convinced. He pawed at the door again, harder this time, his claws scraping against wood. Then he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something that looked almost like pleading. "I can't open it," she told him. "It's rusted shut. Has been for years." He howled again, the sound tearing through the night like a wound. She stood there for 20 minutes, cold seeping through her jacket, watching Shadow pace around the cellar door. He'd stop occasionally, press his ear to the wood as if listening for something, then resume his agitated circling. Finally, when her fingers had gone numb despite her gloves, she gave up. "Come inside," she said. "Whatever you think you hear, it can wait until morning." But Shadow wouldn't leave. He stayed by the door, whining occasionally, never taking his eyes off it. She went back inside alone, built up the fire, made coffee she didn't drink. Through the window, she could see Shadow's dark shape, still keeping vigil. He howled through the entire night. She didn't sleep, just lay in bed listening to that terrible, lonely sound, wondering what it meant. Shadow had never acted this way before. In 3 years, he'd been calm, controlled, almost eerily intelligent in the way he moved through the world. This was different. This was frantic. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, she dressed and went back outside. Shadow was still there, lying next to the cellar door now, exhausted but alert. He lifted his head when he saw her, whined softly. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll look, but there's nothing down there. You understand? Just old junk from people who left decades ago." She went to her shed, got a crowbar and a sledgehammer. The door wasn't going to open easily, but she could be persuasive. Shadow watched as she worked, his tail giving a single, hopeful wag. She wedged the crowbar under the door's edge, put her weight on it. The wood groaned but held. She tried again, harder this time. Something cracked. Not the door, but the frame around it. Oh, with splitting. She set the crowbar aside, gripped the iron ring that served as a handle, and pulled with everything she had. The door gave way suddenly, hinges screaming, decades of sealed air rushing out in a breath that smelled of earth and rot and something else, something that made her stomach clench. Not quite decay, not quite chemicals, something in between, something wrong. Shadow was on his feet immediately, trying to push past her to get down the stairs. "Wait," she commanded, grabbing his collar. "Let me look first." She directed her flashlight into the opening. Stone steps led down, maybe 10 or 12 feet, into darkness. The walls were stone too, old mortar crumbling, but still intact. The air rising from below was cold, damp, stale. And somewhere in that darkness, she heard something. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound. A held breath, a waiting silence. Shadow whined again, pulling against her grip. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we'll go down." But slowly, carefully, she descended first. Shadow pressed close against her leg, both of them moving into the buried darkness together. Section 3. The first reveal mystery deepens. The cellar was larger than she'd expected. Margaret's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls stretching back maybe 20 feet, with a ceiling high enough that she could stand upright. The floor was packed earth, dry despite decades of being sealed. There were shelves along one wall, wooden planks that had somehow survived, holding mason jars covered in dust, their contents long turned to unidentifiable sludge. A root cellar, as she'd thought, a place for storing vegetables and preserved food, built by people who'd lived here long before refrigeration, before electricity, before the modern world had made its way into these mountains. But that didn't explain Shadow's behavior. The wolf had pushed ahead of her now, moving deeper into the cellar, nose to the ground, tracking something. She followed, her flashlight revealing more details. Old burlap sacks rotting in a corner, a broken chair, a lantern with a shattered glass chimney. And then, at the very back of the cellar, Shadow stopped. He sat down, rigid and alert, staring at the wall. "What?" Margaret asked, coming up behind him. "There's nothing there. It's just—" She stopped. The wall wasn't solid stone like the others. It was stone, yes, but the mortar was different, newer, less weathered, and the pattern was wrong. The stones were smaller, less carefully fitted, as if someone had built this section in a hurry, without the skill the rest of the cellar showed. She moved closer, running her hand over the surface. The stones shifted slightly under her touch. Not much, but enough to tell her they weren't properly seated. Enough to tell her this wall had been built after the cellar was constructed. Someone had sealed off part of the cellar, walled something in, or walled something out. Shadow whined, a high, anxious sound she'd never heard from him before. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening. Nothing, just stone and earth and the weight of decades pressing down from above. But Shadow was convinced there was something here. And Shadow had never been wrong about anything that mattered. She went back upstairs, got a pry bar and a hammer, and returned. If someone had gone to the trouble of sealing off part of a cellar, there was a reason. And after 6 years of running from her past, 6 years of not asking questions, 6 years of accepting silence as safety, she was done pretending that buried things stayed buried. She started at the top of the wall, where the newer mortar met the original stone ceiling. The first stone came free easily, crumbling mortar showering down. The second was harder, wedge-tight, but it shifted when she put the pry bar behind it and leveraged her full weight. Shadow paced behind her, agitated, whining continuously now. "I'm working on it," she told him, straining against another stone. "Give me a minute." The third stone came free, and with it, a rush of air from whatever space lay beyond. Colder than the cellar air, carrying that same wrong smell, stronger now. Chemical and organic mixed together, like preserved specimens in a laboratory. She pulled out 3 more stones, creating an opening about 2 feet square. She directed her flashlight through it. The space beyond was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with the same packed earth floor. But it wasn't empty. There were boxes, old wooden crates, military style, stenciled with faded lettering she couldn't read. There were metal containers, sealed with wax or pitch. There were glass jars, much larger than the ones on the cellar shelves, containing something dark and liquid. And in the corner, covered with a tarp that had rotted to threads, there was something that made her breath catch. Bones, not animal bones. She'd seen enough animal skeletons in her work to recognize the difference immediately. Human bones, small ones, a child's skull hollow-eyed and accusing. She pulled back from the opening, her heart hammering, the flashlight shaking in her hand. "Oh, God," she whispered. "Oh, God, what is this?" Shadow pushed past her, squeezed to the opening she created, and went to the bones. He didn't touch them, just sat beside them, looking back at her with those amber eyes. And she understood. This was what he'd been trying to tell her. This was why he'd howled through the night. There was something dead down here. Something that had been dead for a very long time. Something that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. She should leave. She'd climb back up those stairs, close the cellar door, drive to Millbrook, and call the sheriff. This was a crime scene. Old, probably decades old, but still a crime scene. This wasn't something she should handle alone. But she didn't move, because next to the bones, partially covered by the rotted tarp, she saw something that made everything else disappear. A photograph in a metal frame, protected from decay by the sealed space. She climbed through the opening, careful not to disturb anything, and picked up the frame. The glass was intact, the photograph behind it still visible despite yellowing with age. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. They stood in front of the cabin, her cabin. She realized with jolt, or rather, the cabin that had stood here before fire had taken it. The man was tall, stern-faced, wearing overalls and a work shirt. The woman was small, pretty, with dark hair pulled back and an expression that might have been nervousness or fear. The little girl stood between them, her hand in her mother's, looking at the camera with solemn eyes. On the back of the frame, written in faded ink, Chen family, 1938. William, May, and Catherine. Chen, her family name. Her grandmother's maiden name. Margaret turned the frame over, stared at the photograph again, at the woman's face, the little girl's dark eyes, the cabin in the background with its stone foundation, the same foundation her cabin now sat upon. This property hadn't been random. It hadn't been a coincidence that it had been for sale when she'd been looking for a place to disappear to. It hadn't been luck that her grandmother's estate money had been exactly enough to buy it. Her grandmother had left her this place deliberately, had left her the money to buy it, had never, in all of Margaret's 38 years growing up, mentioned that their family had once lived here, once owned this land. once existed in these mountains, had never mentioned what had happened to make them leave. Shadow whined again, softer now, almost apologetic. Margaret looked at the bones, so small, so carefully hidden, and felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like ice cracking, like something frozen for decades finally beginning to thaw. "Catherine," she whispered to the empty air, to the bones, to the ghost of a little girl who died here almost 90 years ago. "What happened to you?" And in the darkness of that sealed room, surrounded by secrets that had waited nearly a century to be found, Margaret Chen understood that she hadn't come to these mountains to escape her past. She'd come to find it. Margaret sat on the cellar floor for nearly an hour after finding the photograph, her mind racing through implications she couldn't quite grasp. Her grandmother, Helen Chen, had died 8 years ago at 93. She'd been a quiet woman, calm and careful, who'd raised Margaret after her own mother, Helen's daughter, had died of cancer when Margaret was 12. Helen had taught her to be self-sufficient, to trust her own instincts, to value silence over empty conversation. But Helen had never mentioned Montana, had never spoken of mountains or a homestead or a cabin that had burned. When Margaret had asked about the family's history, Helen would say only that they'd moved to Oregon from back east when she was young, that her parents had wanted a fresh start, that the past wasn't worth dwelling on. Margaret had accepted those non-answers the way children do, without question, without pressing, assuming that if something mattered, she'd be told. Now she understood. Her grandmother had been the little girl in the photograph, Catherine Chen, who'd become Helen Chen, who'd survived whatever had happened here in 1938 and had never, ever spoken of it, until she died and left Margaret the money to buy this exact piece of land. Margaret looked at the bones again, too small to be an adult's. A child, but not Catherine, because Catherine had survived to become Helen, to live to 93, to die peacefully in an Oregon nursing home. So whose bones were these? She forced herself to move, to think systematically. She couldn't leave the bones here, couldn't disturb a crime scene, but she also couldn't walk away without understanding what she'd found. She took photographs with her phone, dozens of them, documenting everything. The sealed room, the boxes and containers, the bones, the photograph of her family. Then she carefully climbed back through the opening, Shadow following close behind. Upstairs in the clean morning light, the world looked normal. Pine trees swaying in the breeze, birds calling, the sun warming the clearing, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and pulled out her laptop. The satellite internet was slow, but eventually it connected. She started searching. Chen Family, Montana, 1938, Bitterroot Homestead Fire, Missing Children, Montana, 1930s. Nothing. No records, no news articles. Nothing that matched what she'd found. She tried different searches. Millbrook, Montana history. Bitterroot Range settlers, 1930s, Homestead Fires, Montana. Still nothing specific. But she found a reference to the Millbrook Historical Society, housed in the public library. They maintain archives of local newspapers, property records, and family histories. If there was information about what had happened to the Chen family, it would be there. She looked at Shadow, who'd settled by the stove, exhausted from his night-long vigil. "We're in a town," she said. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked forward. "I know. I don't like it either. But we need answers." She'd avoided Millbrook as much as possible over the past 6 years. Monthly supply runs were one thing, quick, transactional, impersonal. But actually engaging with people, asking questions, making herself visible, that felt like exposure, like vulnerability. But her grandmother had left her a mystery wrapped in tragedy, wrapped in decades of silence. And Margaret owed it to whoever had died down in that cellar to find out why. She drove down the mountain road slowly, her old Toyota pickup navigating the switchbacks and washboard sections with familiar difficulty. Shadow rode in the passenger seat, alert and watchful, the way he always was when they left the cabin. Millbrook appeared where the mountain road met the valley, a main street 3 blocks long, buildings mostly from the 1950s, a few older structures from timber and mining days. Population maybe 800. declining every year as young people left and old-timers died off. The library sat on the corner of Main and First, a brick building from 1947, according to the cornerstone. Margaret parked in front, took a breath, and got out. "Stay," she told Shadow, cracking the window. He huffed but obeyed. Inside, the library was quiet, lined with old books and particular smell of aging paper and wood polish. A woman sat at the front desk, mid-70s, white hair in a neat bun, reading glasses on a chain. She looked up when Margaret entered, her expression shifting from neutral welcome to recognition. "Margaret Chen," the woman said. "I was wondering when you'd come by." Margaret stopped. "You know me? Everyone knows you. Wolf woman who lives up on the old Chen property." The woman smiled. "I'm Dorothy Marsh. I run the Historical Society collection. Been waiting 6 years for you to get curious about your family's place." Margaret approached the desk carefully. "My grandmother never mentioned that our family had land here. No, I don't suppose she would have." Dorothy stood, moved to a file cabinet in the back. "Helen Chun, or Catherine, as she was known back then. She left here in 1938 and never came back. Never contacted anyone from the area. Most people forgot the family had ever existed. But you didn't forget. I make it my business to remember." Dorothy pulled out a thick file folder. "When you bought that property 6 years ago, I did some research. Figured you'd eventually want to know what you bought into." She set the folder on the desk, opened it. Inside were photocopies of old newspaper articles, property records, handwritten notes. The first article was from a Millbrook Gazette, dated September 15, 1938. "Homestead fire claims won. Family vanishes." Margaret's hands shook as she read. "A fire of unknown origin destroyed the Chin homestead on Copper Ridge last night, claiming at least one life. Neighbors reported seeing flames around midnight, but were unable to reach the remote property in time to render aid. William Chun, 42, proprietor of the homestead, is believed to have perished in the blaze. His wife, May Chun, 38, and daughter Catherine, 8, are reported missing. Sheriff Tom Briggs states the whereabouts of Mrs. Chun and the child are unknown. An investigation is ongoing." The Chun family had lived on the property for approximately 5 years, maintaining a subsistence farm and occasional trade with local merchants. Neighbors described William Chun as a difficult man, prone to isolation and suspicion. Mrs. Chun rarely visited town and spoke little English. Margaret looked up. "My great-grandfather died in the fire, but my grandmother and her mother escaped." That's what the initial report said. Dorothy flipped to another article, dated 2 weeks later. "Missing woman and child found. Sheriff closes investigation." Sheriff Briggs announced today that May Chun and her daughter Catherine have been located in Missoula, staying with relatives. Mrs. Chun declined to return to Millbrook, citing grief and a desire to start fresh elsewhere. The investigation into the fire has been closed. Sheriff Briggs stated that all evidence points to accidental causes, likely an overturned lantern. Mr. William Chen's death has been ruled accidental. The Chen property remains abandoned. Ownership is in dispute pending settlement of this estate. That's it. Margaret asked, "That's the whole story?" Dorothy's expression was carefully neutral. "That's the official story. But there's always more to a story than what makes it into the newspaper." She pulled out a handwritten document, old, yellowed paper covered in neat script. This is from the diary of Martha Hendricks, who lived about 3 miles from the Chun homestead. She kept journals her whole life. Her family donated them to the Historical Society when she died in 1979. Margaret took the document, began reading. September 14th, 1938. "Terrible news today. The Chun place burned last night. We saw the glow from our cabin, but couldn't get there in time. By morning, the cabin was just smoking ruins. Sheriff came by asking questions. I told him what I knew, which isn't much. William Chun kept to himself, didn't welcome visitors. But I'd seen May Chun and little Catherine a few times when I'd walked the ridge trail. Sweet child, that girl. Always looked hungry, though. Always too thin. May seemed frightened of her own shadow. The sheriff says William died in the fire, that May and Catherine got out. But I wonder. I saw May 3 weeks ago when I was gathering mushrooms near their property. She had a black eye, fresh bruises on her arms. When I asked if she was all right, she just shook her head and hurried away. I hope she and the child are truly safe. I hope they got far from here and never looked back. Margaret set the document down, her throat tight. My great-grandfather was abusive. That's what the evidence suggests, Dorothy said quietly. But nobody talked about that sort of thing back then, especially not when it involved Chinese immigrants. Yes, I'm sorry to put that way, but that's how people thought in 1938. Your family would have been isolated not just by location, but by prejudice. The fire was an accident, Margaret said slowly. My great-grandmother killed him. She set the fire to escape. I can't prove that. Neither could the sheriff, apparently. But yes, that's what I suspect. And I suspect the sheriff suspected it too, but chose to let it go, let a frightened woman and her child disappear rather than pursue charges. Margaret thought about the bones in the cellar. There's something else, something that wasn't in any of these articles. Dorothy leaned forward, interested. What did you find? A sealed room in the cellar, with remains, a child's remains. Dorothy's face went pale. Dear God. There was a photograph, my family, dated 1938, but it only showed 3 people, William, May, and Catherine. If there was another child, it's not in the picture. Dorothy sat down heavily. Give me a moment. She went to her computer, pulled up what looked like census records. Let me check. Chen family, Millbrook area, 1930 census. Here. She turned the monitor so Margaret could see. Household. William Chen, age 34. Mei Lin Chen, age 30. Catherine Chen, age 1. David Chen, age 3. David, Margaret whispered. There was a son, an older brother, who doesn't appear in the 1940 census, Dorothy said grimly. The official records show only May and Catherine leaving Montana. No mention of David after 1935. He died sometime between 1935 and 1938, and they buried him in the cellar and sealed it off. Dorothy looked at her with sympathy and horror mixed together. If William Chen was as violent as the evidence suggests, if something happened to that boy. Margaret stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I need to call the sheriff. This is a crime scene. Those bones need to be examined properly, given a proper burial. That child needs to be acknowledged. Margaret, Dorothy said carefully, this happened almost 90 years ago. Everyone involved is dead. What goodwill? What good? Margaret's voice was sharper than she intended. That child was my grandmother's brother. My family. He died and was hidden away like he never existed, and my grandmother had to live her entire life knowing that, carrying that weight. She deserves to have her brother's story told. He deserves to be mourned properly. Dorothy nodded slowly. You're right. I'm sorry. Of course you're right. She pulled out a business card, wrote a number on the back. This is Sheriff Wade Collins. He's good people. Not like some of the old-timers who'd rather bury history than examine it. Tell him I sent you. Tell him everything you found. Margaret took the card, then hesitated. Why did my grandmother leave me that property? Why did she want me to go back there? I've wondered that myself, Dorothy said. Helen, Catherine. She lived her whole life running from what happened in these mountains. Married a white man. Took his name. Raised her daughter to be American. No connection to Chinese heritage. No mention of Montana. She buried it all. So why send me back? Maybe she wanted the truth to finally come out. Maybe she couldn't face it herself, but she hoped you could. Maybe she wanted her brother to be found, to be remembered. Dorothy paused. Or maybe she wanted you to understand where you came from, the strength it took for her mother to escape, the courage it took to survive. Maybe she wanted you to know that running from trauma is sometimes the only way to survive it, and that's not weakness, that's survival. Margaret felt tears building, blinked them back. She never told me any of this. Shame is a powerful silence. And in 1938, a Chinese woman killing her white husband. Even in self-defense, even protect herself and her children, that could have gone very badly. Better to disappear, to never speak of it. to let it turn into ghost stories and forgotten history. But she left me the money to buy the property. She left me the key to finding this. Yes, Dorothy said. She left you the truth. What you do with it is up to you. Section 5. The Deeper Secret, Second Layer Revelation. Margaret called Sheriff Collins from the library parking lot. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff but not unkind. Collins. Sheriff, my name is Margaret Chen. I live up on Copper Ridge, on the old Chen homestead property. Dorothy Marsh at the Historical Society gave me your number. I need to report. I found something. Human remains. In my cellar. There was a pause. How old are these remains? Very old. I think from the 1930s. I think they're my great-uncle, David Chen. Another pause, longer this time. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Don't touch anything else. Don't disturb the scene. We'll need to document everything properly. I understand. And Miss Chen, thank you for calling. Not everyone would. She ended the call, looked at Shadow through the truck window. He was watching her with those amber eyes, patient and knowing. We're going back, she told him. But we're not alone anymore. Sheriff Collins arrived an hour later in a county vehicle, followed by a coroner's van. He was maybe 50, weathered face and careful eyes, moving with the deliberate precision of someone who'd seen enough tragedy to take it seriously, but not so much that he'd become numb to it. Margaret led him and the coroner, a woman named Dr. Sarah Friedman, down into the cellar, through the opening she'd made into the sealed room. Collins directed his flashlight over everything, taking the bones, the boxes, the photograph, the evidence of decades buried and forgotten. Jesus, he said quietly, this has been here since when? 1938, I think. Maybe earlier. Dr. Friedman knelt beside the bones, examining them without touching. Child, maybe 6 to 8 years old based on skeletal development. I'll need to get these back to the lab for proper analysis, but initial assessment suggests this individual has been deceased for at least 70 to 80 years. Collins looked at Margaret. Tell me everything you know. She did. The whole story, her grandmother's silence, the property purchase, finding the sealed room, the historical records Dorothy had shown her. When she finished, Collins was quiet for a long moment. Your great-grandfather, William Chen. Dorothy showed you the other reports about him. What other reports? Collins pulled out his phone, made a call. Dorothy, it's Wade. Can you pull the incident reports from the Chen property? 1935 to 1938. Yeah, I'll wait. He looked at Margaret. When I took this job 5 years ago, I went through all the old records. Filing system was a disaster. But I found a pattern of calls to the Chen homestead. Neighbors reporting disturbances, sounds of violence, a child crying. Deputies would go out, but William Chen would deny everything, and they'd leave. Different time, different standards. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, then handed it to Margaret. It was a scanned document from 1936. An incident report. Deputy Miller responded to complaint from Martha Hendricks regarding disturbance at Chen property. Upon arrival, found William Chen intoxicated. Male child David Chen, age 8, observed with visible injuries to face and arms. When questioned, Mr. Chen became hostile, ordered deputy off property. Mrs. Chen declined to make statement. Deputy unable to remove child without evidence of immediate danger. Situation monitored, but no further action taken at this time. Margaret's hands shook. They knew. They knew he was hurting that boy, and they did nothing. Different time, Collins repeated, his voice tight with controlled anger. Laws were different. Attitudes are different. But yes, they knew, and they failed that child. How did he die? Margaret asked. How did David die? We won't know for certain until Dr. Friedman completes her analysis, Collins said. But if I had to guess, based on the pattern of abuse and the fact that the body was hidden rather than buried properly or reported, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Dr. Friedman stood, carefully photographing the scene. There are indications of healed fractures in the skeletal remains. Multiple instances over time. This child experienced significant trauma before death. Margaret felt sick. Her great-uncle, beaten repeatedly, killed, and then hidden away in a sealed room like his life had never mattered. And her grandmother, 8 years old at the time, had known, had lived with that knowledge, had watched it happen or had discovered it afterward, and had never, ever spoken of it. What happened to the mother? Collins asked. Your great-grandmother, May Chen, where did she go after the fire? Oregon, eventually. Changed her name, remarried. She died in the 1960s. My grandmother, Catherine, she was raised by May until she was about 16. Then May disappeared. My grandmother said she just left one day. No explanation. Sent money occasionally, but never visited, never called. Collins exchanged a look with Dr. Friedman. Did your grandmother ever talk about her father's death? Never. She said her father died when she was young, and she didn't remember him well. She said the past wasn't important. The past is always important, Collins said quietly, especially when it's this dark. They worked through the afternoon, documenting everything. Dr. Friedman carefully collected the remains, treating them with the dignity they'd been denied in death. Collins photographed the boxes and containers. Opened them carefully. Most contain what you'd expect in a 1930s root cellar. Preserved foods, now spoiled beyond recognition. But one box was different. It was locked, a small metal case with a rusted padlock. Collins broke the lock with bolt cutters. Inside were documents, letters, papers, a diary. He handed the diary to Margaret. This is your family history. You should be the one to read it. The diary was small, bound in leather, the pages yellow but readable. The handwriting was neat, careful, a woman's hand. The first entry was dated January 1933. We arrived at the homestead today. William says this is our chance to start over, to build something of our own. The cabin is small but sturdy. William built most of it himself. He says in America, a man can own land, can be his own master. He says we will be happy here. David is excited about the snow. Catherine is too young to understand where we are, but she seems content as long as I am near. I am trying to be hopeful. The entries continued through 1933 and into 1934. Notes about the weather, the garden, the challenges of living so remotely. But the tone changed as time went on. March 1934. William's temper is worse in the isolation. He says I make too much noise, that I am lazy, that I do not appreciate what he has given us. He struck David today for spilling water. The boy is only 4 years old. I tried to intervene, and William hit me as well. There is nowhere to go, no one to tell. We are too far from town, and my English is not good enough to explain. September 1934. David has learned to be very quiet, very still. He does not play like other children. He knows that noise brings William's anger. Catherine is beginning to understand, too. I try to protect them, but I am only one woman, and William is so much stronger. December 1935. David was not at breakfast this morning. When I went to look for him, I found William in the cellar. He said David had been punished, that he was being taught respect. When I finally saw David, he could barely walk. William forbade me to help him. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She almost stopped reading, but forced herself to continue. The next entry was from January 1936. David is gone. William says he ran away, went into mountains, and did not come back. But I know what William did. I saw the blood on his hands. I saw him digging in the cellar. He thinks I did not understand, but I understand everything. He has forbidden me to speak of David. He says if I tell anyone, he will kill Catherine too. He says no one will believe a Chinese woman over a white man anyway. He is right about that. I must protect Catherine. I must be silent and careful and wait for my chance. But I will not forget David. I will not let him disappear as if he never existed. The entries continued through 1936 and 1937, each one more desperate than the last. May documented the abuse, the terror, the isolation. She documented her plans to escape, plans that repeatedly failed because William watched her constantly. The final entry was dated September 13th, 1938. Tonight, it must be tonight. I have been saving kerosene for weeks, hiding it in jars in the cellar. William drinks himself unconscious most nights now. Tonight, I will wait until he is asleep. I will take Catherine, and we will go. But first, I will make sure William never hurts anyone again. I am sorry for what I must do, but I am more sorry for what I failed to do for David. I should have killed William years ago, before he killed my son. I will not fail Catherine the way I failed David. If anyone finds this, please know, I tried to be good. I tried to obey, to be the wife William wanted. But goodness is not always enough. Sometimes survival requires darkness. I hope Catherine will forgive me someday. I hope she will understand why I never speak of this place, why I must bury this history as deep as David is buried. Some secrets are too heavy for children to carry. Margaret closed the diary, tears running freely now. Her great-grandmother had killed her husband, had burned the cabin with him inside it, had fled into the night with her daughter, leaving behind a sealed room with her dead son's bones. And she carried that weight for the rest of her life, never speaking of it, never sharing the burden, dying with the secret still locked inside her. Colin stood beside Margaret, his hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry your family went through this. I'm sorry the system failed them so completely. What happens now?" Margaret asked. "We give David Chen a proper burial. We close this case officially. And we make sure the record reflects what really happened. Not the sanitized version from 1938, but the truth, that a woman and her children were terrorized by a violent man, that the system failed to protect them, and that when Mei Chen took action to save herself and her daughter, it was justice, not murder. Will that change anything? No. Everyone involved is long dead. But the truth matters. Acknowledgement matters. David Chen's life mattered. Even though it was cut short, his death mattered. And your family's courage in surviving matters." Dr. Friedman approached, her expression gentle. "Margaret, when we're done with the forensic analysis, where would you like David's remains to be buried?" Margaret looked around the cellar. The stone walls that had witnessed so much pain, the sealed room that had held her uncle's bones for 85 years, the foundation her cabin now sat upon. "Here," she said, "on the property, where he lived, where he should have been allowed to grow up. I want a proper grave, with a headstone that has his name. David Chen, 1931 to 1936. Beloved son and brother." "We can arrange that," Colin said. Shadow, who'd been sitting quietly at the top of the cellar stairs, whined softly. Margaret looked up at him. "It's all right, boy. We found him. That's what you were trying to tell me, wasn't it? You knew something was down here. You knew he needed to be found." Collins looked at the wolf with new respect. "Animals know things we don't. I've learned not to question it." Section 6. The threat escalates external pressure. The investigation took 3 days. During that time, Margaret stayed in town, getting a room at Millbrook's only motel, a strip of connected cabins left over from the 1960s motor lodge era. She couldn't bear to sleep in her cabin knowing what lay beneath it, knowing the weight of history pressing up from below. Shadow stayed with her, an unusual arrangement that the motel owner, a weather woman named Betty, accepted without comment after Margaret explained she was helping with police investigation. "You're the wolf woman," Betty had said, not unkindly. "Figured you'd show up in town, eventually with a story. They always do, the ones who go to the mountains looking for peace. Usually takes longer than 6 years, though." "I wasn't looking for a story," Margaret had said. "None of us are. But we find them anyway, don't we?" On the second day, Dr. Friedman confirmed what they'd all suspected. David Chen had died from blunt force trauma to head, consistent with being struck by a large object or thrown against a hard surface. The fractures in his other bones told a story of prolonged abuse. He'd been 8 years old when he died. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire, the way news always did in small towns. Margaret became a subject of intense curiosity. People staring at her when she walked to the diner for meals, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. Most of the attention was sympathetic. People brought her casseroles and baked goods, left them at the motel office with notes expressing sorrow for what her family had endured. Tom Grady from a general store stopped by to tell her he'd known something was off about that property, that he'd always felt uneasy about the old Chen place. But not everyone was sympathetic. On the third evening, as Margaret was walking Shadow back from dinner at the diner, a truck pulled up beside her. A man in his 60s leaned out the window, red-faced, aggressive. "You're making a lot of trouble, digging up old history," he said. Margaret kept walking. "I'm not making trouble. I'm finding truth. That Chinaman probably deserved what he got. Probably beat his wife. Probably killed that boy himself." She stopped, turned to face him. "My great-grandfather was white. His name was William Chen because he married a Chinese woman. And yes, he beat his wife. He killed his son. That's exactly what happened." The man's face twisted. "You're lying. Try and make white folks look bad. Make it seem like we're all—" "I'm making him look bad. One violent man. Not all white people. Not all men. Just him." Shadow growled, low and dangerous, moving between Margaret and the truck. The man looked at the wolf, at Margaret, and spat on the ground. "You and your animal need to leave this town. We don't need outsiders stirring up trouble." He drove off before she could respond. She stood there, shaking slightly, Shadow pressed against her leg. "I'm not an outsider," she said to the empty street. "This is my family's place. I have more right to be here than most." But the encounter rattled her. She'd lived here 6 years without incident, had been left alone precisely because she kept to herself, didn't make waves, didn't ask questions. Now she was visible, exposed, and not everyone appreciated the light. She was shining on Millbrook's ugly history. Sheriff Collins called her that night. "Betty at the motel said you had trouble with Jim Hardwick. You okay?" "I'm fine. He just wanted to share his opinion." "His opinion is garbage. Don't let him get to you. He's one of those guys who thinks any acknowledgement that bad things happened in the past is somehow an attack on him personally. Why would he care about a case from 1938? Because his grandfather was sheriff back then. Tom Briggs, the one who wrote up the official reports, who let William Chen terrorize his family, without real intervention. Jim spent his whole life defending his grandfather's reputation. Hearing that the old sheriff failed to protect an abused child? That doesn't fit his narrative." Margaret sat down on the motel bed, suddenly exhausted. "I didn't do this to attack anyone. I just want to know what happened to my family. I know that. Most people know that. But there's always someone who's going to take it personally, who's going to feel threatened by truth that complicates their simple stories." He paused. "Do you want protection? I can have a deputy check on you periodically." "No, I have Shadow, and I'm not doing anything wrong." "You're not, but be careful anyway. Jim Hardwick's not dangerous, but he's angry, and angry people do stupid things." After she hung up, Margaret sat in the quiet of the motel room, Shadow at her feet, thinking about her grandmother, Catherine Helen. Had left Montana at 8 years old, had watched her mother kill her father, had known about her brother's murder, had carried all of that through her entire life. She'd married, had a daughter, raised a granddaughter, lived 93 years, and never once mentioned any of it. How had she done it? How had she functioned under that weight? Margaret thought about her own isolation, her 6 years in the mountains, her divorce from David who told her she was incapable of connection. She thought she was choosing solitude, choosing strength. But maybe she'd just been repeating her grandmother's pattern, running from pain, burying truth, choosing silence because speaking felt too dangerous. Her phone rang. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello." Heavy breathing on the other end. Then a woman's voice, old and wavering. "Is this Margaret Chen?" "Yes." "Who is this?" "My name is Alice Briggs. I'm calling because I need to tell you something. About your family." Margaret's heart rate picked up. "Go ahead." "My father was Sheriff Tom Briggs, the one who handled the investigation in 1938. I was 14 years old that year. I remember the night your great-grandmother came to our house." Margaret stood up, pacing. "May came to your house?" "Not to the house exactly. To the barn. It was very early morning, September 15th. The fire must have just happened. She had little Catherine with her. The girl was crying. May was covered in soot and blood, and she couldn't speak much English. But she made my father understand. Understand what? That William was dead, that she'd set the fire, that she needed help getting away before anyone found out what she'd done. What did your father do? A long pause. He helped her, drove her and Catherine to Missoula, gave her money from his own pocket, told her to go south, to disappear. He said he'd handle the investigation, make it look like an accident. Why? Margaret asked. Why would he help her? Because he knew what William had done to that family. My father had been out to that homestead a dozen times on calls from neighbors. He'd seen the bruises, the fear. He'd filed reports, but nothing ever came of it. This was 1938. The law didn't care much about domestic situations, especially when it involved immigrants. Alice's voice cracked, and he knew about the boy, David. My father knew that boy had disappeared, and he suspected William had killed him, but he couldn't prove it, couldn't get anyone to care enough to investigate properly. So when May killed William, my father saw it as justice. Not legal justice, but real justice. He helped her escape because he believed she'd done what the system had failed to do. Protect herself and her daughter. Margaret felt tears running down her face. Did he ever tell anyone? He told my mother years later on his deathbed. She told me. It's eaten at me for decades, knowing the truth, wondering if I should say something. But I was afraid. Afraid of what people would think of my father. Afraid of dragging up old pain. Why tell me now? Because you deserve to know. Your grandmother deserves to have the full story told. And my father, he wasn't a perfect man, but he did the right thing that night. He saved your grandmother's life. He gave your family a chance to start over. Margaret sat down heavily. Thank you. Thank you for telling me this. There's something else, Alice said. Something my father told my mother. The night May came to him. She wasn't just asking for help escaping. She was confessing. She told him about David, about what William had done. She told him where David's body was. Sealed in the cellar. She wanted my father to know, wanted someone to know, even if she could never speak of it publicly. Did your father check? Did he confirm it? He went out there a few days after the fire, when the ruins had cooled. He saw the sealed room in the cellar. He knew May had told the truth. But he also knew that if he reported it, May would be arrested, probably hanged for murder. So he kept quiet. Let that secret stay buried. He chose mercy over law. Yes, and he lived with that choice the rest of his life. Some nights I'd hear him talking to himself, asking God to forgive him for perverting justice. But he never regretted it. He always said May Chen had suffered enough, had lost enough. She'd earned her escape. They talked for another 20 minutes, Alice sharing details her father had told her mother, filling in gaps in the story Margaret had pieced together. When they finally hung up, Margaret sat in the dark motel room, shadows warm bulk against her leg, understanding finally the full scope of what had happened. Her great-grandmother hadn't just run. She confessed. She'd trusted one man, a sheriff who'd failed to protect her when it mattered, to hear her truth and choose compassion. And he had. He'd broken the law, falsified reports, helped a murderer escape. Because sometimes the law and justice weren't the same thing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories like this one. The memorial service for David Chen was held on a cold Saturday morning in late October, exactly 1 week after Margaret had opened the cellar door. Sheriff Collins had worked with the county to expedite the process. Normally it would take months to complete a forensic investigation and release remains, but given the age of the case and the circumstances, exceptions were made. David Chen had been hidden for 85 years. He didn't need to wait any longer. Margaret had chosen a spot on the property about 50 yards from the cabin, on a small rise where the morning sun came to the pines, and you could see the valley stretching out below. It was peaceful there, beautiful, the kind of place a child should rest. She'd ordered a headstone, simple granite with clear lettering. David Chen, 1931 to 1936, beloved son, and brother, may you finally rest in peace. Dr. Friedman had released the remains to a local funeral home, where they'd been placed in a small casket, child-sized, heartbreaking in its dimensions. The funeral director, A kind man named Robert Hayes had donated the casket and his services. Some things, he'd said quietly, are more important than money. Margaret had expected a small gathering. Herself, Sheriff Collins, maybe Dorothy from the Historical Society. She hadn't expected the crowd that appeared. By 10 o'clock, more than 50 people stood in her clearing. Some she recognized from town. Tom Grady from the general store, Betty from the motel, Faye, who worked at the post office. But most were strangers. Dorothy approached her, gestured at the crowd. Word got out about what happened to David, about your family story. People wanted to pay respects. I didn't announce a service. I didn't tell anyone the time. Small towns, Dorothy said with a sad smile. News travels, and people are horrified. Horrified that a child was murdered and hidden. Horrified that the system failed him so completely. This is their way of saying they're sorry, that his life mattered, that they witnessed what happened to him. A news van pulled up the road, local station from Missoula. A reporter got out, camera crew following. Margaret tensed. I didn't contact the media. They've been covering the story since it broke, Collins said, coming up beside her. Child abuse case from the 1930s, sealed room, family secrets. It's gotten attention, but they're being respectful. I spoke with them earlier. They'll film from a distance. No interviews unless you agree. I don't want to be interviewed. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. This is David's day, not theirs. But as she looked at the crowd, at all these people who'd come to honor a child they'd never known, who died before most of them were born, she realized that wasn't quite true. This was about more than David. It was about acknowledgement, about saying out loud what had been whispered for generations, that domestic violence happened in good families, in rural communities, in places people wanted to believe were safe, that victims were often silenced not just by their abusers, but by systems that prioritized order over justice, reputation over truth. A pickup truck rumbled up the road, and Margaret's stomach clenched when she recognized it. Jim Hardwick. He parked at the edge of the clearing, got out, stood by his truck with his arms crossed. Watching, his presence felt like a threat, a reminder that not everyone wanted this truth told. Collins noticed, too. He moved toward Hardwick, his body language professional but firm. Margaret couldn't hear what they said, but Hardwick's jaw was tight, his expression hostile. After a minute, he got back in his truck and drove away, but not before giving Margaret a long, hard look. Problem? Dorothy asked quietly. Just someone who wishes the past would stay buried, Margaret said. At 11 o'clock, they began the service. There was no clergy. Margaret wasn't religious, and she didn't know what faith her family had practiced, if any. Instead, Dorothy had arranged for a local poet, a woman named Sarah Whitehorse from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, to speak words of blessing. We gather on land that has known sorrow, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the clearing. We gather to honor a life cut short by violence. We gather to say what should have been said 85 years ago, that David Chen's life mattered, that his death was wrong, that those who failed to protect him bear responsibility for that failure. She spoke about cycles of violence, about the importance of breaking silence, about how acknowledging past wrongs was a first step toward preventing future ones. Then she invited Margaret to speak. Margaret hadn't prepared anything, hadn't known what to say to honor an uncle she'd never known existed until a week ago. But she stepped forward, looked at the small casket, and found words coming. David Chen was 8 years old when he died. She began. He liked snow. He learned to be quiet to avoid his father's anger. He protected his younger sister as best he could. He died alone and afraid, and then he was hidden away like his life was shameful, like he was something to be forgotten. Her voice strengthened. But he wasn't shameful. The shame belongs to the man who killed him. The shame belongs to a system that saw the bruises, heard the neighbors' reports, and did nothing. The shame belongs to all of us when we choose silence over action, when we decide that some violence isn't our problem. She looked at the crowd, saw people nodding, saw tears on many faces. My grandmother lived with this knowledge her entire life. She watched her father kill her brother. She helped her mother escape. And she never spoke of it because she believed correctly that no one would understand that people would judge her mother for fighting back, that the truth was too ugly to be told. But silence didn't protect her. It just isolated her. It made her carry this weight alone for 93 years. Margaret took a breath. I'm not going to be silent. I'm not going to let David be forgotten again. His story matters. My family's story matters. And every family that's living with violence, living in fear, believing they have no way out, their stories matter too. She looked directly at where Jim Hardwick's truck had been parked. Some people want the past to stay buried. They want us to pretend that bad things didn't happen, that everyone did their best, that we should just move on. But we can't move on from what we don't acknowledge. We can't heal what we don't name. So I'm naming it. My great-grandfather, William Chen, murdered his 8-year-old son. He terrorized his wife and daughter. And the people who could have stopped him, the neighbors, the deputies, the sheriff, they failed. They failed David. They failed my great-grandmother May. They failed my grandmother Catherine. Her voice was fierce now, strong. But May didn't fail. She saved her daughter. She survived. She found a way out when every door had been closed. And yes, she killed a man who was killing her family. That wasn't weakness. That was strength. That was survival. The clearing was absolutely silent except for the wind in the pines. David Chen deserved to grow up. He deserved to have children and grandchildren. He deserved to live a full life. He didn't get that. But what he deserves now is to be remembered, to be mourned, to have his story told truly. She placed her hand on the casket. Rest now, Uncle David. You're not hidden anymore. You're not forgotten. You're home. Sarah Whitehorse sang then, a traditional blessing in Salish, her voice rising and falling like the wind. Others joined in, people Margaret didn't know, tribal members who come to honor a child who'd been, like their own ancestors, a victim of violence that was systemic and unacknowledged. They lowered the casket into the ground. People came forward one by one, placing flowers and stones and small offerings on the grave. Margaret watched through tears as strangers honored her uncle, as a community tried to make amends for failures committed long before most of them were born. When it was over, when the last person had paid respects and the crowd began to disperse, the reporter from the Missoula station approached Margaret. Ms. Chun, I'm Amanda Torres. Would you be willing to say a few words on camera? About what happened here, about why this story matters. Margaret's instinct was to refuse, to retreat back to her cabin, back to silence, back to the safety of isolation. But she thought about her grandmother, about 93 years of silence. She thought about May, who confessed her truth to one sympathetic sheriff, but had never been able to speak it publicly. She thought about all the families still living in fear, still believing they had no recourse. Yes, she said, I'll talk to you. Section 8, the victory resolution achieved. The interview aired that evening on the Missoula News, then was picked up by Montana's statewide networks. By Monday morning, it had gone national. Margaret had been careful in what she said. She'd told David's story, the abuse, the murder, the decades of burial. She'd talked about systemic failures, about how communities often knew violence was happening but chose not to intervene. She'd spoken about her grandmother's silence and the weight it had imposed. But she'd also been clear about context. This wasn't about demonizing Millbrook or the sheriff's department or even Tom Briggs, who made complicated choices in an impossible situation. It was about acknowledging patterns that still existed, about naming failures, so they could be corrected. We can't change what happened to David, she'd said to the camera, but we can change how we respond to violence now. We can believe victims. We can intervene. We can make it clear that abuse isn't a private family matter. It's a community responsibility. The response was overwhelming. Her phone, which barely worked in the mountains, started getting voicemails from reporters from domestic violence organizations, from people sharing their own family stories of violence and silence. Dorothy called to say the Historical Society had been flooded with donations for a domestic violence prevention program they wanted to establish in David's name. Sheriff Collins stopped by the cabin on Tuesday with news. The Montana Attorney General's office is reviewing historical cases of domestic violence that were inadequately investigated. Your family's case is being used as an example of systemic failure. They're talking about creating new protocols for how law enforcement handles abuse reports, especially in rural areas. Margaret sat on her porch, shadow at her feet, trying to process it all. I didn't expect this. I just wanted David to be buried properly. You told the truth, Colin said. Sometimes that's all it takes to start something bigger than yourself. He hesitated, then continued. Jim Harwick filed a formal complaint against me yesterday. Said I was sullying his grandfather's reputation. That Sheriff Briggs was a good man who did his job properly. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause problems for you. You didn't cause anything. The truth caused it. And truth is never the problem. It's the solution. He smiled slightly. Besides, the complaint was dismissed. The county board reviewed the historical records, including the ones Alice Briggs provided about her father's actions. Their conclusion was that Tom Briggs acted with moral courage in a situation where the law itself was unjust, that he may have been procedure, but he saved lives. So Jim's grandfather isn't being vilified? No, he's being recognized as someone who had to choose between the letter of the law and actual justice. History is complex. Tom Briggs failed David Chen by not investigating more aggressively when the boy was alive, but he saved May and Catherine by helping them escape. He was both flawed and courageous. That's being acknowledged. Margaret thought about her own great-grandmother, victim and killer, survivor and fugitive, someone who'd lived with impossible choices and unimaginable guilt. What happens to Jim Harwick now? He'll stay angry, probably. Some people can't handle complexity. They need their heroes to be pure and their villains to be obvious. But most of the community understands. They've actually been quite supportive of you, of David's story, of using this to make things better going forward. After Collins left, Margaret walked to David's grave. The mound of earth was still fresh, but flowers covered it. People continued to leave them, driving up the mountain road to pay respects to a child most had never heard of until 2 weeks ago. Shadow followed her, as he always did. He sat beside the grave, and Margaret sat next to him, her hand buried in his thick fur. You knew, she said quietly. Somehow you knew he was down there. You knew he needed to be found. Shadow huffed, leaned against her. She thought about the night he'd started howling. Only 2 weeks ago, though it felt like months. The frantic urgency, the insistence that she pay attention, that she look beneath the surface of the life she'd built. If he hadn't howled, she might never have opened that cellar door, might have lived her whole life on this property without knowing what lay beneath it, might have repeated her grandmother's pattern, running from connection, choosing silence, believing that isolation was the same as safety. But Shadow had refused to let her hide. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Chun, my name is Dr. Rachel Winters. I'm a psychologist who specializes in intergenerational trauma. I'd like to speak with you about your family story. Not for publication, but to help me understand how trauma patterns pass through families even when the original trauma is never discussed. Would you be willing to talk? Margaret stared at the message. A week ago, she would have deleted it immediately, would have rejected any intrusion into her carefully maintained isolation. But her grandmother had spent 93 years in isolation, had died without ever speaking her truth, and that silence hadn't protected her. It had just made her loneliness permanent. She typed back, "Yes, I'd be willing to talk." More texts came throughout the day. A filmmaker wanted to make a documentary about David's case and how it reflected broader patterns of institutional failure. A domestic violence nonprofit wanted Margaret to speak at their annual conference. A graduate student studying historical child abuse cases wanted to interview her for their dissertation. She said yes to some, no to others, but the important thing was that she was engaging. She was stepping out of her self-imposed exile and choosing to be part of something larger than her own story. On Wednesday, Dorothy called. "Margaret, there's something you should see. Can you come to town?" "What is it?" "It's better if you see it for yourself." She drove to Millbrook, Shadow in the passenger seat, apprehensive about what Dorothy might want to show her. But when she arrived at the Historical Society, she found something she hadn't expected. The main room had been transformed into an exhibition, The Chen Family and the Hidden History of Domestic Violence in Rural Montana, 1930 to 1940. There were photographs, the one she'd found in the cellar, enlarged and professionally displayed, historical documents, census records, the newspaper articles from 1938. But there were also new additions, other cases from the same era, other families who'd suffered violence, other children who'd been failed by systems that weren't designed to protect them. "We've had 20 families come forward," Dorothy said quietly. 20 families who'd never spoken about their own histories of abuse, who'd buried their stories the way your grandmother buried hers. Seeing David's story, seeing you refuse to be silent, it gave them permission to speak. Margaret walked through the exhibition, reading stories of survival and loss, of women who'd fought back and children who hadn't survived. Each story was different in its details, but similar in its shape. Violence normalized, victims blamed, systems failing to intervene. At the end of the exhibition was a wall where people could write messages. It was covered with notes. "Thank you for telling the truth. My grandmother survived violence too. I never knew until now. Sarah M. David Chen's story is my uncle's story. He died in 1942 after years of abuse. We never talked about it. Thank you for making space to remember. James K. I survived domestic violence. Left 3 years ago. Stories like this remind me I made the right choice." Anonymous. For everyone who's still trapped, who thinks there's no way out, there is. Reach out. Ask for help. You deserve to be safe. Millbrook DV Hotline. Margaret stood in front of the wall, reading message after message, understanding finally that David's story wasn't just about the past. It was about now. About every person currently living in fear, currently believing they had no options, currently being told that violence was their fault or their burden to carry alone. "We're establishing a fund," Dorothy said. "The David Chen Memorial Fund for Domestic Violence Prevention and Support Services. We've already raised $50,000. It'll go toward crisis services, legal support, emergency housing, all the things that might have saved David if they'd existed in 1936. That's incredible. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. It's action instead of silence. That matters." Tom Grady appeared, carrying a large framed photograph. "Margaret, we wanted you to have this." It was a photograph from the Cellar, her family in 1938, but it had been restored and enlarged. The image was clear now, every detail visible. May's cautious expression, Catherine's solemn eyes, William's stern face, and superimposed on the photo, translucent but visible, was an image of David, taken from a school photo, the only picture of him that had survived. He stood between his parents, his hand reaching for his sisters, present and acknowledged. "We couldn't find a photo with all 4 of you together," Tom said. "So we made one. This is how your family should have been, complete, together, visible." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing him, for making him real." Section 9. The New Life, Epilogue and Future. 6 months later, on a warm April morning, Margaret stood on her porch watching spring arrive in the mountains. The snow had melted, revealing tender green shoots pushing through last year's brown grass. The aspens were budding, that bright yellow-green that meant renewal, rebirth, another cycle beginning. Birds she hadn't heard all winter called from the trees. Mountain bluebirds, warblers, the very thrush with its haunting single-note song. Shadow dozed in the sun beside her, his winter coat beginning to shed, leaving tufts of gray for caught on everything. He was getting older. She could see it in how long it took him to stand after lying down, in how he chose shorter hikes now, conserving energy. But his eyes were still alert, still watchful, still seeing things she might miss. Her cabin looked different now. She'd rebuilt the cellar entrance, creating a proper door with new hinges and a lock. The cellar itself was empty. She removed everything after the investigation concluded, had the space professionally cleaned, sealed the room where David had been hidden, but she hadn't sealed the memory. David's grave was a permanent fixture on her property now, with flowers that bloomed in spring and summer, a small bench where she could sit and talk to him about her day, about what had changed, about what was coming next. She hadn't left the mountains. Some people had expected her to, had assumed that discovering her family's tragedy would drive her away, would make this place too painful to inhabit. But the opposite had happened. Understanding why she'd been drawn here, why her grandmother had left for this land, had made it more meaningful, not less. She wasn't running anymore. She was staying, rooting down, choosing to be present. The isolation had changed, though. She still lived alone, still preferred quiet to crowds, still needed solitude to function. But solitude wasn't the same as disconnection anymore. She drove to Millbrook twice a week now, had coffee with Dorothy at the diner, helped with historical society programs, taught wilderness safety classes at the community center. She joined the board of the David Chen Memorial Fund, helped distribute money to families escaping violence, spoke at fundraisers about breaking cycles of silence. She'd even started dating someone, a widowed forest ranger named Marcus, who understood that she needed space, who didn't demand she be different than she was, who could sit in comfortable silence and understand that quiet wasn't rejection, just peace. It wasn't serious yet, might never be serious, but it was connection. It was practice in letting someone close without panic. It was proof that her ex-husband had been wrong. She wasn't incapable of relationship. She just needed people who understood that there were different ways to love, different speeds of opening up. The documentary about David's case had aired 2 months ago. Margaret had watched it in her cabin, alone except for Shadow, crying through most of it. The filmmaker had done something remarkable. She connected David's story to 15 other historical cases of child abuse in rural communities, showing patterns of institutional failure that stretched across decades and states. The film had won awards, had been screened at domestic violence prevention conferences, had resulted in new legislation in Montana and 3 other states, requiring more aggressive follow-up on abuse reports, mandatory training for law enforcement on recognizing abuse patterns, protection for victims who fought back against their abusers. David's death was becoming the catalyst for changes that might save other children. It didn't make his loss acceptable, didn't make what had happened to him okay, but it gave his life meaning beyond tragedy. Margaret had been contacted by distant family members, cousins she'd never known existed, descendants of her great-grandmother's siblings who'd stayed in China. They'd watched the documentary, had reached out wanting to know more about their American relatives, wanting to understand the branch of the family that had vanished in 1938. She'd learned that May had sent letters back to China in the years after she escaped, let her family know she and Catherine were safe but couldn't return, couldn't explain what had happened. The family had accepted that, had mourned the loss, but had understood that sometimes survival required disappearing. Now they were reconnecting, sharing photographs and stories, building bridges across decades of silence. Her grandmother had died believing she was alone, that her history had to stay buried. But Catherine Chen, Helen, had left a granddaughter who refused to accept that silence, who'd open the cellar door and let the light in. Margaret walked to David's grave, Shadow following slowly. She knelt beside it, traced the letters of his name. "Hi, Uncle David," she said quietly, the way she did every morning. "Spring's here. The wildflowers will be blooming soon. I planted some native species around your headstone. Indian paintbrush, lupin, asters. Dorothy says they'll attract butterflies." She sat back on her heels. "Your fund helped 3 families escape violence this month. 3 mothers and 5 children. They're safe now, in shelters where their abusers can't find them. They're getting counseling, legal help, job training. They're going to be okay. And people are talking now about the violence that happens behind closed doors, about how we all have responsibility to intervene, to believe victims, to make help accessible. Your story did that. Your death, terrible as it was, is changing things." A hawk called overhead. Shadow's ears pricked forward, tracking it. "I'm okay, too," Margaret continued. "I know you can't really hear me, that this is just me talking to myself, but it helps. Acknowledging you, keeping you part of my life. You're not hidden anymore. You're family." She stood, brushed off her jeans. "I have to go to town this morning. There's a meeting about expanding the crisis center. More funding came through, from the state this time, not just donations. They want to build a safe house that can accommodate 10 families. They're going to call it David's Place. She touched the headstone one more time. You would have been 94 this year. Would have had children, grandchildren, maybe great-grandchildren. You deserve that life. I'm sorry you didn't get it. But your legacy is going to be helping other children survive. That's something. That's everything. The meeting in Millbrook ran long. Discussions about building codes and funding timelines and staffing requirements. Margaret contributed when she had expertise to offer, stayed quiet when she didn't. It felt natural now, being part of something, working with others toward a shared goal. Afterward, she had lunch with Marcus at the diner. He told her about a bear he'd tracked that morning, about trail conditions in the high country, about the first wildflowers he'd spotted. Normal conversation. Easy conversation. The kind she'd once thought she couldn't do, couldn't sustain. "You're smiling," Marcus said. "Am I?" "Yeah, it's nice." She realized he was right. She was smiling, not forcing it, not performing happiness, actually feeling it. "I'm glad I stayed," she said. "In Montana, I mean, in Millbrook. I almost left after everything with David's case. It would have been easier to run. But you didn't." "No, because running was what my grandmother did. What May did. They survived by leaving, by burying the past. And that worked for them. They had to do what they had to do. But I have different choices. I can stay. I can remember. I can turn tragedy into something that helps others." Marcus reached across the table, took her hand. She didn't pull away. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "You've honored your family by refusing to let their story disappear. That takes courage." "It took Shadow," she corrected. "I wouldn't have found any of it if he hadn't howled at that cellar door." "Where's Shadow today?" "At the cabin. He's getting older, doesn't like long car rides anymore. I'll be heading back soon. He worries if I'm gone too long." Marcus smiled. "A wolf who worries. That's something. He's not really a wolf anymore. He's family." She drove back up the mountain in the late afternoon, windows down, spring air rushing in. The road was muddy from snow melt, requiring careful navigation, but she knew every curve now, every washout and rocky section. When she pulled up to the cabin, Shadow was waiting on the porch, tail wagging slowly. He'd heard her coming from a mile away, his hearing still sharp even as his body aged. "Hey, boy," she said, climbing out. "Miss me?" He huffed, pushed his head against her hand. Inside, the cabin was warm from the afternoon sun. She left windows open, letting in fresh air. Everything was as she'd left it. Simple, clean, exactly what she needed. But it didn't feel isolating anymore. It felt like home base, a place to return to after being out in the world, not a fortress to hide behind. She made dinner, pasta with vegetables from last year's garden that she preserved. She ate on the porch, Shadow at her feet, watching the sunset behind the western peaks, turning the sky orange and pink and purple. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Winters, the psychologist who'd been helping her understand intergenerational trauma. "How are you doing today?" Margaret typed back, "Good. Really good. Actually, had a productive meeting about the safe house. Had lunch with a friend. Came home to my cabin and my wolf and my mountains. Feels like I'm finally living instead of just surviving. That's wonderful. That's exactly what healing looks like." She set the phone down, looked at Shadow. "You changed 2 lives, you know. You changed mine by making me open that door, face what was buried. And you changed David's. You gave him acknowledgement, remembrance, the chance to have his story matter." Shadow's amber eyes reflected the sunset. He didn't howl now. He'd stopped howling the night she'd opened the cellar door, as if his message had been delivered, his purpose fulfilled. But sometimes, late at night, she'd hear him make a soft sound, not quite a howl, more like a murmur, talking to the mountain, maybe, or to David's spirit, if such things existed, keeping watch the way he'd always done. Margaret thought about her grandmother, about Catherine who'd become Helen, who'd survived violence and loss and decades of silence, who'd died believing her story had to stay buried. "I wish you'd known," she said to the sunset, to her grandmother's ghost, to anyone who might be listening. I wish you'd known that speaking the truth doesn't destroy you. That people can handle complexity. That being a survivor doesn't mean you have to suffer in silence forever. I wish you'd known that your mother was brave, not shameful. That she saved you because she loved you. That what she did was survival, not sin. I wish you'd had what I have now. Community, connection. People who understand that sometimes the past has to be excavated before the present can be built on solid ground. The sun dropped below the peaks, leaving behind that particular quality of light that only happened in mountains. Soft and blue and infinite. Margaret went inside, built a fire, settled on her couch with a book. Shadow curled on a rug, his breathing slow and steady. Outside, the mountains held their silence. The good kind of silence now, not the crushing kind. The kind that made space for thought, for peace, for healing. She'd come to these mountains 6 years ago running from a life that had felt suffocating, from a husband who'd told her she was broken, from a world that seemed to require her to be smaller than she was. She thought she was choosing isolation, choosing safety. But what she'd actually done was come home, to her family's land, to a story that needed telling, to a truth that had waited 85 years to be found. Shadow had known. Somehow, he'd known that beneath the surface of her carefully constructed solitude, there was work that needed doing, secrets that needed exposing, a child who needed to be found and honored. And now that work was done, not finished. Healing was never finished, but begun, acknowledged, moving forward. Margaret Chen, 58 years old, living alone at 7,400 feet in the Bitterroot Range of Montana, was finally learning what her grandmother had never been able to learn, that surviving wasn't the same as living, that silence might feel like safety, but speaking the truth, even when it was painful, even when it exposed things people want to keep hidden, was the only way to actually heal. She closed her book, looked at Shadow sleeping peacefully. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for howling. Thank you for refusing to let me hide. Thank you for changing 2 lives." Outside, the mountains settled into night. Stars emerged, brilliant and cold and constant. And inside her cabin, built on the foundation of her family's tragedy and triumph, Margaret Chen slept peacefully for the first time in years. Not because she'd escaped her past, because she'd finally faced it. 1 year after Margaret opened the cellar door, the David Chen Memorial Safe House opened its doors in Millbrook. The building sat on 2 acres at the edge of town, a renovated former church that had been empty for 15 years. Dorothy had discovered that the property was owned by the county, abandoned when the congregation had dwindled to nothing. She convinced the county commissioners to donate it for the safe house, arguing that a building once meant for sanctuary should continue serving that purpose. The renovation had taken 8 months and $340,000, money that had poured in from across the country after the documentary aired. Domestic violence organizations, private donors, grants from foundations that supported rural crisis services, even small donations from people who'd seen David's story and wanted to help. Margaret stood in the main common room on opening day, surrounded by people who'd made this possible. The space was warm, welcoming, soft colors, comfortable furniture, children's toys in one corner, a kitchen visible through an archway. Nothing institutional, nothing that felt like hiding. 10 bedrooms upstairs could house 10 families, mothers and children escaping violence, given safe space to heal and plan their next steps. There was a counseling office, a legal aid office staffed by volunteer attorneys, a child care room, so mothers could attend appointments without worrying about their kids. "It's perfect," Marcus said quietly, standing beside her. They'd been together for 8 months now. Not living together, that felt too fast, but committed, connected, building something steady. "It's what should have existed for May," Margaret said. What might have saved David if she'd had somewhere to run before things got that desperate. Dorothy approached, smiling broadly. "Margaret, there's someone I want you to meet." She led Margaret to a young woman standing near the children's area. Early 30s, dark hair pulled back, nervous energy radiating from her. "This is Lisa Martinez," Dorothy said. "She and her 2 kids are going to be the first family to stay here." Lisa extended her hand, shaking Margaret's firmly. "Ms. Chen, I wanted to thank you for telling your family's story. for making this place possible. Please call me Margaret, and you don't need to thank me. I do, though. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. I left my husband 3 weeks ago, took my kids, and just drove. I had nowhere to go, no money, no plan. I was sleeping in my car, trying to figure out what to do. Then I saw the news about this place, about David Chen, about how his story was helping other families. I called, and they said yes. They said we could come here, that we'd be safe. She wiped her eyes. My husband told me nobody would help me, that I had no options, that if I left, I'd be homeless and lose my kids. But he was wrong. There are options. There are people who care. And it's because of your family, because you refuse to let David be forgotten. Margaret's throat tightened. She pulled Lisa into a hug. You're incredibly brave. You saved yourself and your children. That's everything. How old are your kids? Marcus asked gently. 6 and 8. Same ages as... She trailed off, looking at Margaret. Same ages as Catherine and David. Margaret finished. I'm glad they're safe now. I'm glad you all are. After Lisa moved away to talk with the house director, Margaret stood quietly, processing. A mother and 2 children, the same ages her grandmother and great-uncle had been when everything fell apart. But this time, there was help. This time, they wouldn't have to face violence alone or make impossible choices in desperation. This time, the system was there to catch them. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a crowd. Local officials, donors, members of the domestic violence prevention community, reporters from 3 states. The governor sent a representative who gave a speech about Montana's commitment to protecting vulnerable families. But the moment that mattered most to Margaret came when Sheriff Collins unveiled a plaque beside the front door. David's Place David Chen Memorial Safe House, established 2024. In memory of David Chen, 1931 to 1936, and all children lost to family violence. May this place offer the safety they deserve. May their stories inspire action, not silence. Below the dedication were the words May had written in her diary, the words that had haunted Margaret since she'd first read them. Sometimes survival requires darkness, but what comes after should be light. Margaret touched the plaque, running her fingers over David's name cast in bronze, permanent and acknowledged. Shadow pressed against her leg. He was 12 now, moving slowly, sleeping more. But he'd insisted on coming to town for this, had whined until she'd helped him into the truck, had stayed close to her side all day as if understanding the significance. He knows, Dorothy said, watching the wolf. Animals understand grief and healing better than we do sometimes. He's the reason any of this exists, Margaret said. If he hadn't howled, if he hadn't made me open that door. But he did. And you listen, that's what matters. Section 11. Connections Found Family Reunification. 2 weeks after the safe house opening, Margaret received a package from China. It was large, carefully wrapped, covered in customs decorations and shipping labels. The return address was from Guangzhou. Inside was a letter written in English, though clearly translated. Dear Cousin Margaret, my name is Chun Wei. I am the grandson of your great-grandmother May's younger brother, Chun Liang. Our family in China has followed your story with great interest and emotion. We want you to know about the woman you call May, who we knew as Chun Mei Lin. She was born in 1900 in our village outside Guangzhou. She was the eldest daughter of our great-grandparents, known for being clever and independent, qualities that worried her parents, as such traits were not valued in women at that time. In 1928, she was married to William Chun, an American man of Chinese descent who had come to China seeking a wife. Your great-grandfather presented himself as successful, established, promising a good life in America. Our family was hopeful. They believed Mei Lin would have opportunities in America she could never have in China. She wrote letters home for several years. They were cheerful at first, describing Montana, her children, the homestead. But gradually, the letters became less frequent, more guarded. By 1935, they stopped entirely. We did not know what had happened to her. Some family members believed she had died. Others thought she had simply forgotten her Chinese family, had become too American to maintain connections. Then, In 1947, a letter arrived. It was from Mei Lin. She said she had survived a great tragedy, that she had a daughter who was safe, that she could not return to China, but wanted her family to know she was alive. She asked for forgiveness for her silence. She sent money, American dollars that our family desperately needed after the war. She continued to send money for years, until she died in 1968. We never saw her again, never heard her voice, but we knew she had survived something terrible, and we honor her silence. The letter continued for several more pages, telling stories about May's childhood, her personality, her hopes and dreams before America. Chen Wei had included photographs, old, faded images of a young Mei Lin in China, smiling and vibrant before trauma had marked her. There was also a family tree, carefully drawn, showing how Margaret connected to dozens of cousins across China and America, branches of the Chen family she'd never known existed. At the bottom of the package was something that made Margaret's breath catch, a small silk bag containing a jade pendant on a delicate chain. This belonged to Mei Lin, the letter explained. It was given to her by our great-grandmother on her wedding day, meant to protect her and bring fortune. She sent it back to our family in 1947 with a note saying she no longer needed protection, that her daughter was safe, that the pendant should stay with the family in China where it belonged. But we have discussed this among all the relatives, and we agree the pendant should return to Mei Lin's descendants. You are her granddaughter. You have honored her memory by telling her truth. You have turned her tragedy into help for others. She will be proud. Please accept this pendant as a symbol of our family's connection, past and present. Mei Lin is not forgotten in China. Neither is David. We mourn him too. Margaret held the jade pendant up to the light. It was simple, beautiful. Carved in the shape of a lotus flower, symbol of purity rising from mud. She fastened it around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her chest. Connection to a great-grandmother she'd never met, to a family history that spanned continents and languages and generations of silence. That evening, she video-called Chen Wei using the contact information he provided. The connection was poor, pixelated and laggy, but she could see him clearly enough. A man in his 50s, kind eyes, sitting in what looked like a modest apartment. "Margaret," he said, his English accent but clear, "I am honored to meet you, even this way. I'm honored to meet you too. Thank you for the letter, for the photographs, for the pendant. It belongs with you. You are Mei Lin's legacy, as we all are, but you have done something we could not. You have spoken her truth publicly. That takes great courage." They talked for an hour. Chen Wei told her about the family in China, teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, farmers, ordinary people living ordinary lives, connected to her by blood and history. He told her that when the documentary about David had been translated and shared online in China, it had sparked conversations about domestic violence there too, about how traditional values of family privacy sometimes enabled abuse, about how silence protected abusers more than victims. "Your great-uncle's story has meaning even in China," Chen Wei said. "Even though he never lived here, never knew this part of his family. His death speaks to something universal, the cost of valuing family reputation over family safety." "I wish he'd had a chance to know you all," Margaret said. "To know he had family who would have loved him. We do love him. We honor him. And we honor what you have done with his memory." Before they ended the call, Chen Wei asked, "Will you come to China someday? Meet the family in person? See where Mei Lin was born?" Margaret thought about it. The older would have said no immediately, would have found reasons why it was impossible, too complicated, too overwhelming. But she was different now. "Yes," she said. "I like that. Maybe next year." Chen Wei smiled broadly. "We will prepare a welcome. The family is large. You will meet many cousins. But we are all connected, all part of the same story." Section 12. Shadow's Goodbye Full Circle. Shadow died on a cold November morning, 18 months after he'd first howled at the cellar door. Margaret woke to find him lying peacefully by the wood stove, his breathing shallow, his eyes clouded with age. She knew immediately that this was the end, had known for weeks, really, watching him slow down, watching him choose the warmth of the cabin over the wildness of the forest. She sat beside him, her hand on his thick fur, feeling each breath grow more labored, more spaced out. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can rest now. You did what you came here to do." His amber eyes found hers, held them. Some clarity came back for just a moment, and she saw recognition, connection, understanding. "You saved me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved David. You changed everything. Thank you, Shadow. Thank you for Howling." His tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, just an acknowledgement. Then, as the morning sun broke through the window and lit the cabin with golden light, Shadow took one more breath and was still. Margaret sat with him for a long time, her face buried in his fur, sobbing. She'd known this day was coming. Wolves didn't live forever, and Shadow had already outlived most wild wolves by years. But knowing didn't make the loss less sharp. Finally, she called Marcus. He came up the mountain immediately, helped her wrap Shadow in a blanket, helped her choose a spot. They buried him next to David's grave. It felt right. The wolf who'd found the boy, the animal who'd refused to let a child stay hidden, resting beside the child he'd helped honor. Dorothy drove up that afternoon with flowers. Sheriff Collins came too, standing quietly at the grave, his hat in his hands. He was a good wolf, Collins said simply, did more good than most humans manage. Margaret had commissioned a headstone, smaller than David's, but equally permanent. Shadow guardian and friend, he knew, before we did what needed to be found. As the sun set that evening, Margaret sat between the two graves, the jade pendant around her neck, Marcus beside her, and spoke to both the child and the wolf who'd brought everything to light. "You're together now," she said, "guardian and guarded. I don't know if there's anything after this, if spirits persist or if consciousness just ends. But if there is something, I hope you found each other. I hope David knows what Shadow did for him. I hope Shadow knows how much he mattered." Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, allowing comfort, allowing connection. "Are you going to get another dog?" he asked gently. No, Shadow wasn't replaceable. He was singular. He came into my life exactly when I needed him, stayed exactly as long as necessary, and left when his purpose was fulfilled. Another animal would be different, would be its own story. You'll be alone up here again. Not alone, just solitary. There's a difference now. Section 13. Full integration, present day, 2 years later. Margaret stood in front of 200 people at the Montana Domestic Violence Prevention Conference, a microphone in her hand, her heart steady. 2 years ago, speaking to this many people would have been impossible. She would have declined the invitation, would have found reasons why someone else should tell the story, would have hidden behind her carefully maintained isolation. But that woman didn't exist anymore. "My name is Margaret Chen," she began. 3 years ago, I was living alone in the mountains, convinced that isolation was safety, that silence was strength. I'd been there for 6 years, running from a painful divorce, from a life that felt suffocating, from a world that seemed to require me to be smaller than I was. Then my wolf started howling. She told the story, all of it, finding the cellar, discovering David's bones, uncovering her family's history of violence and silence. She talked about May's courage in escaping, about Catherine's burden of carrying secrets, about how trauma patterns pass through generations even when the original trauma was never discussed. "My grandmother died believing her story had to stay buried," Margaret said. She thought speaking the truth would destroy her family, would expose them to judgment and shame. So she stayed silent for 93 years. And that silence didn't protect her. It just isolated her. It made her loneliness permanent. She paused, looking at the audience. Social workers, counselors, law enforcement, advocates, survivors. But here's what I've learned. Truth doesn't destroy. Silence destroys. Shame destroys. Keeping violence hidden because we're afraid of what people will think, that destroys. Speaking the truth is terrifying. It makes you vulnerable. It invites judgment. But it also invites connection, support, healing. And it prevents the next tragedy by showing others that escape is possible, that they don't have to suffer alone. She talked about David's place, about the 73 families who'd found safety there in the past year. She talked about the legislative changes that had resulted from David's case, better training for law enforcement, stronger protection for victims who defended themselves, increased funding for rural crisis services. One child who died in 1936 has saved dozens of children in 2024, she said. That's the power of refusing to let stories stay buried. That's what happens when we choose truth over silence. After her speech, people lined up to talk to her, survivors sharing their own stories, advocates asking for advice on building community support. Researchers want to understand intergenerational trauma patterns. She talked to every single person, no longer overwhelmed by connection, no longer depleted by social interaction. She'd learned to pace herself, to take breaks when needed, to honor her need for quiet without using it as an excuse to avoid people entirely. That evening, she had dinner with a group of conference attendees, something the old Margaret would never have done. They talked about their work, their challenges, their hopes for preventing violence before it started rather than just responding after damage was done. You become quite the advocate, one woman said, a crisis center director from Washington. 3 years ago. Could you have imagined this? No, Margaret said honestly. 3 years ago, I would have told you I was incapable of this, that I was too broken, too damaged by my divorce, too introverted to be effective in public. What changed? I stopped confusing introversion with trauma. I stopped using my preference for solitude as an excuse to avoid all connection. And I found a purpose bigger than my own comfort, honoring my uncle, helping other families avoid my family's fate. That purpose pulled me out of isolation. Section 14. The documentary follow-up, Legacy Secured. The filmmaker who'd made the original documentary about David's case contacted Margaret with a proposal, a follow-up film documenting the changes that had resulted from the first one. We want to show impact, Sarah, the filmmaker, explained during a video call. We want to demonstrate that telling these stories actually changes things, that they're not just emotionally compelling, but functionally important. What would that involve? Filming at David's place, interviewing families who've been helped, talking to legislators about the policy changes, and following you, showing how you've integrated this into your life, how you've moved from isolation to advocacy. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. She'd told her story publicly once, at great personal cost. Did she need to do it again? But then she thought about the families still trapped, still believing they had no options, about the communities still choosing silence over intervention, about the system still failing to protect vulnerable people. Okay, she said, on one condition. We also tell the stories of families who've been helped by David's place. They're the real evidence that this work matters. Not me, them. The filming took place over 6 months. Cameras captured life at David's place. Mothers learning job skills, children playing safely, counselors helping families plan their futures. They filmed legislative hearings where David's case was cited as evidence for stronger protections. They interviewed Sheriff Collins about changes in how law enforcement handled domestic violence calls. And they filmed Margaret, teaching her wilderness safety classes, having coffee with Dorothy, visiting David's grave, video calling her Chinese relatives, living a life that was both solitary and connected, both independent and integrated into community. One scene Sarah insisted on filming. Margaret and Marcus hiking together in the mountains, shadows old routes, talking about life and loss and learning to trust again. You're a different person than you were 3 years ago, Marcus observed on camera. Same person, Margaret corrected, just not hiding anymore, not using solitude as armor, not confusing self-protection with self-isolation. Do you miss Shadow? Every day. But I understand now why he came into my life when he did. He was a catalyst. He forced me to look at what I was avoiding, to confront what was buried, both literally, with David's remains, and metaphorically, with my own patterns of running from pain. The documentary included an interview with Lisa Martinez, the first mother to stay at David's place. She sat in the apartment she now rented, her own place, safe and stable, her children playing in the background. I've been out for 2 years now, Lisa said to the camera. My ex-husband doesn't know where we are. We're safe. The kids are thriving. No more walking on eggshells, no more fear. We have a normal life. And it started because I heard David Chen's story. Because Margaret Chen refused to let her family's tragedy stay hidden. That gave me permission to seek help, to believe that leaving was possible. The filmmaker asked, "What would you say to Margaret if she were here?" Lisa looked directly at the camera, tears in her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to speak the truth. Thank you for making David's place possible. You saved my life. You saved my children. We will never forget that." Section 15. The Final Truth, May's Letter. On the 3rd anniversary of opening the cellar door, Margaret received one more package from China. Chun Wei had been going through family archives more thoroughly. He explained in an accompanying letter, and had found something that had been carefully preserved but never shared outside the family. A letter May had written in 1967, shortly before her death, meant to be given to Catherine if she ever asked about the past. Catherine had never asked. The letter had stayed in China, undelivered, waiting. "My dearest daughter," it began, May's handwriting shaky with age and illness. "I am dying. The doctors say I have perhaps weeks, perhaps days. I find I cannot leave this world without writing down what I have never been able to say aloud. You were 8 years old when I killed your father. Old enough to understand what happened. Young enough that I hoped you might forget. I have watched you grow into a woman. Strong, independent, carefully controlled. And I see that you did not forget. You simply learned to carry the weight silently, as I taught you. I am sorry for that. Sorry for teaching you that silence was survival. Sorry for modeling a life of hiding rather than healing. But I want you to know the full truth before I die. The parts one never told anyone, not even Sheriff Briggs, who helped us escape. Your father did not always hurt us. When I married him, he was kind, ambitious, proud to have a Chinese wife, proud to build a homestead, proud to have children. For the first years in Montana, we were happy. But isolation changed him. The hard winters, the failed crops, the loneliness. It twisted something inside him. He began drinking. His temper grew shorter. His hands grew harder. Your brother, David, bore the worst of it. He was the oldest child. The son William had hoped would be strong and obedient. But David was gentle, thoughtful. He cried easily. He loved books and quiet things. William saw this as weakness, tried to beat strength into him. I tried to protect David. I stood between him and your father countless times. But I was not always there. I could not always prevent the violence. The night David died, January 15th, 1936, I was tending to you. You had a fever, were calling for me. I left David alone with William for perhaps 30 minutes. When I came back, David was unconscious on the floor. William was standing over him, drunk and angry, saying the boy had been disrespectful, had needed to learn. David died that night. He never regained consciousness. He was 8 years old. William buried him in the cellar, sealed the room, told me that if I spoke of it, he would kill you too. He said no one would believe a Chinese woman over a white man anyway. He was right about that. I lived with David's body under our feet for 2 more years. 2 years of pretending nothing had happened. 2 years of protecting you while grieving your brother in silence. I planned to kill William almost from the moment David died. But I had to wait for the right moment. Had to ensure he would survive. Had to make certain I could get us away safely. The night I set the fire, I was not afraid. I was not conflicted. I knew exactly what I was doing. I waited until William passed out drunk, locked him in the bedroom, poured kerosene around the cabin's perimeter, and lit it. Then I took you and we ran. I did not look back. I did not feel guilt. I felt only relief that the monster who had killed my son would never hurt another person. Sheriff Briggs helped us disappear. He gave us money, drove us to Missoula, told him to go south and never return. He said he understood why I had done what I did. He said he would have done the same. I moved us from place to place for years, Washington, Oregon, California, always using different names, always staying ahead of anyone who might connect us to the fire in Montana. I worked whatever jobs I could find, kept you fed and safe, taught you to be American, to forget China, to forget Montana, to forget the past entirely. When you were 16, I left you with a good family in Oregon. I sent you money, made sure you finished school, but I did not stay close. I thought my presence would only remind you of the trauma, would keep you tied to the tragedy. I thought I was protecting you by leaving. I thought silence was kindness. But I see now that I was wrong. The silence I taught you has made you isolated, careful, afraid to trust. You married a good man, but kept him at distance. You have no children. I do not know if this was choice or circumstance, but I wonder if you feared passing on the darkness you inherited. If you are reading this, Catherine, it means I am gone and you have finally asked about the past. I want you to know, you are not responsible for what happened. You were a child. You were innocent. David's death was not your fault. It was your father's evil, nothing more. My choice to kill William was justice, not sin. I would make the same choice again. And you, my precious daughter who survived, who grew strong despite everything, you deserve happiness. You deserve connection. You deserve to live without the weight of my secrets. If you have children or grandchildren, tell them the truth. Tell them about David. Tell them that silence does not protect. It only imprisons. Tell them that speaking truth is frightening but necessary. Tell them that survival alone is not enough. We must also heal. I love you, Catherine. I am sorry I could not be the mother you deserved. But I did the best I could with what I had. And I hope that counts for something. Your mother, Margaret Chen. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Her grandmother had never seen this letter, had never known that May had tried to give her permission to speak, to heal, to live without the burden of silence. Catherine had died believing she had to keep the secret forever, had died without knowing that May's final wish was for the truth to be told. But Margaret could honor that wish now, could honor both women, the grandmother who'd survived by silence, and the great-grandmother who'd finally understood that silence was a cage. She drove to David's grave, brought the letter with her, and read it aloud, to David, to Shadow, to the mountain air, to anyone who might be listening. May wanted the truth told, she said when she finished. She wanted the silence broken. And it is. Your story is told, David. Your life matters. And May, great-grandmother I never met, your courage is acknowledged. Your choices are understood. You are not judged. You are honored. She placed a letter in a protective sleeve and took it to the Historical Society, where it was added to the permanent exhibition about the Chen family. This is the final piece, Dorothy said, reading it with tears in her eyes. This is May's voice finally heard. Section 16. Coming home, full circle, final scene. 5 years after finding the cellar, Margaret stood on her porch watching the sun rise over the Bitterroot Range, a cup of coffee in her hands, warmth seeping through the ceramic mug. The mountains looked the same as they had that first morning when she'd arrived, endless ridges fading to blue, pines thick and dark. The valley stretched out below like a promise, but she saw them differently now, not as a hiding place, as home. Her cabin had changed. She'd added a room, a guest bedroom for when Marcus stayed over, which was most weekends now. They still maintained separate primary residences. She needed her solitude, he understood that, but they'd built something steady and real, a relationship that honored both independence and connection. The porch had new furniture, a bench where she could sit with visitors, because she had visitors now. Dorothy came up monthly, bringing news and supplies and conversation. Lisa Martinez and her kids came occasionally, hiking the trails, healing in the mountain quiet. Chun Wei had visited last summer, meeting his American cousin in person, walking the land where May had lived and suffered and survived. David's grave was well tended, always covered in flowers that people brought. It had become a pilgrimage site of sorts. Families who'd escaped violence would come to pay respects, to acknowledge the child whose death had catalyzed so much change. Shadow's grave beside it was equally honored. Someone, Margaret didn't know who, had started a tradition of leaving small stones on his headstone, a Jewish custom for honoring the dead. The pile grew steadily, a cairn of remembrance for a wolf who'd known what humans had tried to forget. Margaret had written 2 books. The first, Buried Silence. One family story of violence, survival, and breaking free had been published 18 months ago and had become a bestseller. It told her family story in full, incorporating May's letter, the diary entries, the historical context. The second book, after the Howling, Learning to Live Beyond Survival, had just been released. It was more personal, about her own journey from isolation to integration, about understanding the difference between healthy solitude and traumatic withdrawal, about choosing connection even when it felt terrifying. Both books donated all proceeds to David's Place and similar programs across the country. She taught workshops now, at domestic violence conferences, at universities studying social work and psychology, at community centers trying to build support systems for vulnerable families. She spoke about recognizing abuse patterns, about how to intervene effectively, about creating safety nets before crisis happened. It was exhausting work, but it was meaningful, and she'd learned to balance it. Weeks of intense engagement followed by weeks of quiet in her cabin, recharging in the solitude she still needed. Her phone buzzed. A text from the current director of David's Place. Family number 127 just arrived. Mother and 3 kids. They're safe now. Thank you for making this possible. 127 families in 5 years. 127 mothers who'd found courage to leave. Hundreds of children who'd escaped violence, who'd have a chance to grow up without trauma defining every moment. Not enough. It would never be enough. But something, everything. Margaret walked to the graves, her morning ritual. She told David about family number 127, about the book's success, about the speaking engagement next month in Seattle. She told Shadow about the deer she'd seen yesterday, about the early snow expected next week, about how much she still missed his warm bulk against her leg. I'm going to China next spring, she said to both of them. Chun Wei wants me to meet the whole family, see where May was born, walk the land she walked before America. I'm nervous about it, that many people, that much connection, being so far from home. She paused, smiled, but I'm going anyway, because that's what I do now. I lean into the discomfort. I choose connection over isolation. I honor your legacy by living fully, not just surviving. The sun cleared the eastern peaks, flooding the clearing with golden light. A hawk called overhead. The mountains held their silence, the good kind, the kind that made space for thought and peace and healing. Margaret Chen, 63 years old, living alone but not isolated, was exactly where she belonged, not because she'd escaped her past, because she'd excavated it, examined it, transformed it into something that helped others. She'd opened the cellar door. She'd let the light in, and in doing so, she'd freed not just David's bones from their burial, but herself from the prison of inherited silence. The wolf had howled. She had listened, and 2 lives had changed. The child whose story was finally told, and the woman who'd found the courage to tell it. Behind her, the cabin door opened. Marcus stepped out, 2 fresh cups of coffee in his hands. "Morning," he said, joining her on the porch. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep. Too much gratitude, I think." Gratitude? She gestured at the graves, at the mountains, at the life she'd built from tragedy and truth. For all of this, for Shadow finding David, for having the courage to look, for discovering that speaking truth doesn't destroy you, it frees you, for finding family you didn't know existed, that too, for learning that connection doesn't require you to be different than you are, for understanding that you can be both solitary and integrated, both independent and part of something larger. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day begin. And from the mountains, maybe imagination, maybe memory, maybe something more, Margaret thought she heard it. The echo of a howl, urgent and knowing, calling her to wake up, to look deeper, to refuse the easy comfort of burial and silence. She'd answered that call, and it had changed everything. Not just 2 lives, but hundreds, and counting.